All right, welcome everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the first event of the Network for International and Comparative Education, or NICE for short. My name is Mary Mendenhall, and I am an associate professor in the International and Comparative Education program at Teachers College, Columbia University. I have the honor of moderating today's event. Just a quick background about NICE. The NICE initiative was created by Dr. Leslie Bartlett at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and my colleague here at Teachers College, Dr. Oren Pismoni-Levy, along with a group of founding institutional members that continues to grow. The goal of NICE is to offer a new online monthly colloquium featuring speakers who span diverse topics, methods, and regions in the field of international and comparative education. NICE has already planned 4 speakers for this semester, which you can see on your screen for a few more seconds. And now that you've signed up for today's event, we'll be sure to keep you informed about future announcements about these activities, and then what's planned ahead for the next semester. So please help us spread the word, and also feel free to make recommendations about speakers that you would like to learn more from. And hopefully you're seeing here that we are recording this event, so keep that in mind as we move into the program. All right, I'm going to stop sharing so we can switch gears here a little bit. All right, great. So for now, let's turn to our first speaker. It is absolutely my pleasure to introduce Dr. Diana Rodríguez Gómez, who's an alumna of our program at Teachers College. Dr. Rodríguez Gómez is an assistant professor in the Educational Policy Studies Department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her scholarship examines state building and education policy making processes in contexts shaped by high levels of violence, specifically armed conflict. Through ethnographic, visual, and collaborative research approaches, she attends to the everyday processes of statecraft. Her most recent work has appeared in the American Educational Research Journal, Ethnography in Education, Globalization Societies in Education, and the Journal of Education in Emergencies, where she co-edited a special issue on education and the war on drugs. Her work has also been supported by Colciencias, the Fulbright Commission, the Concha Delgado Gaitán Early Career Presidential Fellowship, and the Spencer National Academy of Education Postdoctoral Fellowship. In a moment, I'll paste the bio for Deanna in the chat, so you can take a closer look as we move forward. So the plan for today is for Dr. Rodríguez Gómez to share her talk, Schooling in Illegal Economies, a study of educational experiences in Southern Colombia's coca fields, for about 30 minutes. And then we'll open it up to Q&A. And so I am looking forward to an interactive conversation with our guest today. Please use the Q&A button that you'll hopefully find at the bottom of your Zoom screen to post questions at any time during the talk today. So Deanna, I'm switching to first names. I hope that's okay with you. Thank you so much for being with us today, and I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mary. Good morning, everybody. First of all, I want to thank NICE and its founding members for inviting me to launch this virtual talk series. It's great to have the opportunity to share with you preliminary findings, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts on the ideas that I'm going to present today. So, Schooling in Illegal Economies, a study of educational experiences in Southern Colombia's coca fields, is a study that I'm conducting in collaboration with 2 co-researchers, Alexis Hoyos, that hopefully is here, Jesus Hidrogo, and Milena Morales. The presentation, here we go, Zoom. Okay. The presentation will follow this order. First, I wanna frame the study. I wanna share with you the conceptual framework that supports this work. Then I will move to research question and research design. I want to highlight my argument and hopefully spend most of the time presenting findings and implications. I will stick to the 30-minute rule. Okay, so first of all, coca Coca is this shrub native to the Indian region with straight branches and lively green leaves that make the plant an easy target for aerial fumigation. Coca is a plant with significant nutritional value that has been outlawed by the UN conventions alongside cocaine and heroin. So what I'm trying to do here is to make very clear difference between coca and cocaine, which is just one of the things that you can produce with coca leaves. So right now we're facing two different responses to coca cultivation. One is the war on drugs, and the other one is the drug policy reform movement. So what I'm going to do in the next 3-4 minutes is to give you a little bit of context about these two responses. So the war on drugs was initiated by the Nixon administration as a set of domestic policies here in the US that aimed to dismantle leftist anti-war efforts and the organized of Black communities. Then the Reagan administration made it a defining feature of US international relations, particularly with its neighbors in the Americas. Its emphasis on the prohibition of the production, commercialization, and consumption of psychoactive substances implies that the drug supply chain of cocaine, opium, and other substances is only sustained through violence. Since the 1980s, presidents around the world have made this war the official policy of their governments, and some examples are Belisario Betancourt in Colombia, Felipe Calderón in Mexico, and Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines. These intensified anti-drug campaigns have caused dramatic levels of violence and social suffering across the world. In Colombia, coca was historically and is to this day cultivated by indigenous communities. However, its use was radically transformed back in the 1970s with the rise of the global drug market. In 1989, as the Cold War was losing importance as a narrative to justify intervention in other countries, George H.W. Bush officially declared the war on drugs in Latin America. Since then, the high point of military aid to Colombia materialized in a series of aid packages co-funded by both countries, Colombia and the US, known as Plan Colombia. In a country with more than 50 years of internal armed conflict, Plan Colombia was based on the premise that by eradicating coca, that plant that I just showed you, the state will be able to weaken the finances that sustain guerrilla and paramilitary groups. Consequently, violence between these groups and the national army will be drastically reduced. While Plan Colombia officially ended during the Obama administration back in 2016, its legacy endures. Plan Colombia has been the blueprint for redesigning anti-drug policies across the world, including the Mérida Initiative in Mexico and Central Americas. So governments have justified the war on drugs in the name of protecting children and youth from a global menace, turning coca, marijuana, and poppy seeds into battlefields, and the communities that make a living from the drug market into policy, military, and chemical warfare targets. For children and youth across the drug supply chain, anti-drug policies mean fear of violence, threats against teachers and direct attacks on schools, health risks associated with aerial glyphosate fumigation, lower school level achievement test scores, opportunities to participate in criminal economies, separation from loved ones. Think about all the women and men who are incarcerated due to drug offenses. And of course, the stigma and discrimination that comes with drug use. So despite extensive investments, coca cropping and cocaine production and consumption haven't stopped. People are still using cocaine. So there's, in response to this phenomenon, we now find a global policy reform movement that is pushing for a paradigm shift. This movement prioritizes public health and safety principles. It advocates for eliminating punitive approaches to drugs and stopping the criminalization of those involved in the drug supply chain. In Colombia, the reform has come to life through the creation of an advisory commission for drug policy, the emergence of harm reduction initiatives, and the development of new legal markets for coca. In 2017, a farmers organization in Limas, one of the towns where this study was located, started commercializing coca for agro-industrial purposes. Through an alliance with Colombia's National Training Service, coca farmers obtained for the very first time a permit to purchase, transport, and stock raw coca leaves. So at this point in Colombia, particularly in southern Colombia, you're going to find that these two global responses to coca cultivation are coexisting. So a little bit of background. Scholars, the field of education emergencies has spent a lot of time in analyzing the intersection between armed conflict and education. And thanks to this work, we know that there are physical consequences of war shaping educational systems across the world. So we know that in situations and contexts of armed conflict, schools have been used for many types of military purposes: bases, barracks, detention center, targets, and even recruitment centers for child soldiers. A recent report by the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack provides ample evidence that in recent years, school populations have been threatened, injured, tortured, and killed by armed groups while in school or in a way to or from school. Despite the field's growth, there is a dearth of research on how political and economic arrangements linked to political insurgency and illicit economies influence school life. This gap is further confirmed by a recent systematic review of the literature and education in the context of the war on drugs I co-authored with my friend and colleague, Maria Jose Bermeo. So without denying that war is a force that destroys, I draw from Civil War studies to conceive war as a catalyst for new local realities, new orders, and even new long-term structures. Here, I just want to mention again that Colombia has been going through armed conflict for the last 70 years. I use this idea to explore the educational order created by the illegalized coca market in southern Colombia for the last decades. I place schooling at the interface of a political order established by the national state, challenged by illegal armed groups, and impacted by global drug policy, an agroeconomic order with legalized and illegalized dimensions. What I'm trying to do here is to consider the interplay between educational and economic factors, mainly coca markets, to grasp how educators and students are positioning themselves vis-a-vis the intersection between schooling and these two coca economies, the legal and the illegal coca economy. I'm conceiving the market as a localized set of social actors, transactional relations, trade practices, and products that forge relationships and practices outside its most obvious boundaries. So what I'm trying to do is to see how these two different markets are connecting with everyday school life. So based on these ideas, what we're trying to do here is to answer the following question. How do the illegal coca economies shape educational practices in one of Colombia's largest coca cropping areas? So to answer this question, as you can imagine, this study is set in Colombia, the largest exporter of cocaine. What we're trying to do is to compare these two different sites. So one town is, we call it here Tambores. It has a school with 430 students. It's located in a semi-urban area of 48,000 inhabitants, located 30 kilometers from the department capital and 40 kilometers from the coca fields that feed narco trafficking. The school serves urban and rural students from the surrounding villages. And the reason why I brought this picture is because this was an activity where students were analyzing what happened outside town in the rural areas. So here, coca cropping, it's considered an outside phenomenon. So we compared how teachers and students were making sense of coca economy in Tambores to Limas. Limas, it's a very different location. So it is a small town of 2,500 inhabitants. It is 110 kilometers from the departmental capital. And because this is a very mountainous area, it means that it will take you around 3 hours to get to Limas. It's completely surrounded by coca fields. And here, in contrast to Tambores, where the coca fields are feeding the illicit economy, here you're gonna see both economies coexisting. And I brought you this picture because I don't know if you can see, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but here you see a farmer just taking care of a plant. That light green plant is a coca plant. So data collection methods for this study included archival work in the United States at the Library of Congress and WikiLeaks Public Library of US Diplomacy, and in Colombia at the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Education, semi-structured interviews, participant observation, and youth narratives. Unlike classic ethnographic work, and I'm looking forward to talking more about this with you all, where the ethnographer travels and immerses herself in a distant community. In this project, we opted for a collaborative design where a local coordinator and two researchers, both of them alumni for each of the schools selected for the study, collaborated to collect and analyze the data. So we conceive the research process as a process of exchange where each team member leads conversations on different topics depending on expertise. So my argument, without denying the destructive power of war, and particularly the war on drugs and armed conflict here in Southern Colombia, in this study, what we're trying to do is to recognize its potential to create unexpected and disparate connections between sectors that are rarely in dialogue. In this case, the war on drugs has linked educational access and retention to the illegalized coca economy, making schooling dependent on the ebbs and flows of the coca market. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the findings that support this argument. So I didn't want to design this PowerPoint without sharing with you just a short excerpt from all the congressional debates about Plan Colombia. So this is a quote from Senator Durbin, who said, what I'm trying to do in this slide is to show you the contrast between how US senators understand what coca is and what it does in to different communities, in contrast to how local people make sense of the plant. So we won't use helicopters to secure areas where we can send down planes to spray with Roundup, that's glyphosate, these coca plants and kill them so that coca is not turned into paste and white powder and sold in the streets of Washington, D.C. and Chicago, addicting people and sending them to prison after committing crimes. That is a good thing to do. I support the administration in their efforts to achieve that. So see how here coca is just thought of as a plant that kills, la mata que mata, for those of you who are Spanish speakers. And then when you go to the field, you hear very different interpretations of what coca is. So here we have a testimony from Melania, 11th grade student. These crops are persecuted since after 6 months they start to produce and the payment is higher. That is why most young people seek to work around these areas. These crops have increased violence, the battle for territories, and the death of young people, adults, and social leaders. But many of these crops have made possible for many families to have a plate of food. So here we see that when the halls of Congress, the coca plant is presented as a military objective. In Southern Colombia, interlocutors alluded to coca as a plant that guarantees their livelihoods, but also they recognize it as an ancestral plant and medicine and a way to support the community. So then I'm gonna take you to Tambores and then to Limas. Something that it's very evident in the data from Tambores is the distance between coca plantations and schooling. So coca seems to be a force that is pulling out students from school. So I have all this. Okay, I hope now the screen is cleaner. I'm sorry for that. So here we have two quotes. I'm just going to read the one from Henry. He's a teacher of economics and philosophy, and he has been working in Tambores for the last 25 years. So I will say that one of the leading causes of the school dropouts is the coca economy. People seeing coca as a solution to the enormous economic problems they face. Unsurprisingly, many children abandon their studies to go to those areas. And then in the quote from Algemiro, the ethics and religion teacher, he's talking about staying there in the coca fields and moving to other municipalities, depending on opportunities to harvest coca. So it's distant, but at the same time, because of the commitment of teachers in this particular school, you will find that there's a lot of conversation about coca, the licit and the illicit side of coca. So I brought you this quote from Marta Lucia, the natural sciences teacher, which I think it's really powerful because it shows us how she's bringing these topics into her classroom. And I brought you the quote from Marta Lucia, but here are all the other teachers that also described how they were talking about coca in their classes. So they, the students, like to talk about coca because they know the subject. For example, right now we're making a herbarium that shows local flora, and giggling, they say, "Miss, can I add a coca plant? Can I add a marijuana leaf?" It comes to their minds because when we say representative vegetation, their most representative plants are coca and marijuana. So why tell them don't put it? Instead I say, okay, let's look at it, make a taxonomic classification. Then they name all the uses and benefits because these plants have many. So to summarize, in Tambores, coca is something that is happening far away from the school, but there's opportunities within the curriculum to discuss the different uses of the plant. Now, I'm going to take you to Limas, the smaller town. And here you find an intimate connection between the plant and the community. So just to give you two brief examples, families name their first crop after their first child. And as the children grow older, families assign sections of their coca fields to their children as a savings strategy. And it was very common to hear teachers talking about not paying too much attention if students were coca cropping or just taking care of coffee, tomatoes, bananas, or oranges. It was all the same. It is not only that the plant is very close to where they live, but it's also that they play an active role in coca cultivation. So in these two quotes, what you can see is how both teachers and students have been coca cropping. And the reason why I think this finding is so important is because it disrupts the way in which the media represents coca farmers on one side and then students and teachers on the other. These findings just show how these different positionalities or identities come together. So I'm going to read the last piece from Adolfo's quote. "I feel it here in my heart, coca cropping, because I have lived it. I grew up in the middle of coca plants. I know them. I have planted them." And then we have a student who's explaining how he owns a little bit of land where he crops coca, and his siblings do the same. So it's not only that the relationship is close and that they participate, this has educational effects. And this is what we're trying to sort out at this point. We found that there's a strong connection between educational access and retention and the cycles of the coca economy. So in this quote, Miguel captures the dynamics of this connection between market and educational access. If there is a bonanza, the kids want to leave to go to work. If there is a shortage, they will go elsewhere to look for the place where coca is abundant. So let me expand this a bit. Here you will see three different moments. Harvest, that's when the economy is stable, and coca, in contrast to other plants, it's the plant that you can harvest 4 times a year, in contrast to coffee, for example, that you can only harvest it for once a year. So look at this teacher. Alvaro is saying, when the economy is good, the parent doesn't complain. When there is good price, parents collaborate, they buy materials, teachers, let's do it and contribute. In other words, good things are done here at school when the economy is good. When the economy is good, students have the learning materials they need. They will have breakfast at home. They will parents will contribute with their time to take care of the school and all the pathways that allow kids to come to school. That is very different from what happens when the state arrives to eradicate coca. So here we have a quote from Ramon, who's a social science teacher. As long as there is coca, we'll have more students. Then they will not leave. But when coca runs out, the families leave and we're left without children. Adriana summed it up in a beautiful way. Glyphosate drives the students out of a school. And it pushes kids out of a school for two reasons. The first one is, as soon as the military leaves, students are going to be helping their parents to I can't remember the word, but just to rebuild the plantation. And if that's not a possibility, what they will do is just move to the next municipality. And then we have at the peak of the market, which it happened during the pandemic. During the pandemic, the prices of cocaine just skyrocketed. So we have a quote from Gladys, a Spanish teacher, saying, during the pandemic, everybody was working in the coca fields. They got used to that and didn't want to return to school. They got used to working and having money. They didn't want to come to school. It was hard to bring them back. And here, the next question that we had was, okay, so if they're making money, what's happening with that money? And in contrast to these ideas that coca farmers are becoming rich from coca cropping, what we find is that money is used to sustain their livelihoods. I mean, it is used to buy cell phone, snacks, learning materials, also to sustain elders. And in the case of this quote that was shared by Alicia, a student is excited about Eastern because he will be able to work, to earn money, to take care of his pet. That was his responsibility, to make sure his pet will have enough money. So implications. The first one, we know this. I mean, we know that the dynamics of educational access are deeply linked to illegalized crops. And what these findings suggest, I think that later we'll need a larger quantitative analysis, is that educational access is deeply linked with the distance between the school and the plantation and the relationship that the community has with plants. And educational access is a localized practice that requires contextual analysis, considering the interplay between legalized and illegalized market. And the reason why I'm using these terms is because I want to emphasize the constructive nature of what counts as legal and as illegal. So these findings add to the emerging educational research that illustrates how the war on drugs has shaped educational spaces that educators and students are navigating daily. Undoubtedly, across the continent, opportunities to enter and remain in a school are defined not only by traditional educational actors. This includes policymakers, public employees, school administrators, educators, parents, and students, but also by non-educational actors such as national armies, insurgent groups, drug traffickers, gangs, and as we're trying to illustrate here, coca and the coca market. We emphasize that the drug policy reform movement should move from eradicating to regulating a sustainable legal coca market, and current reforms should reflect local understandings of what coca is and does for communities. And the final implication is, even though what I show you today feels very local to Southern Colombia, this is a worldwide phenomenon. Despite the fact that the war on drugs directly impacts hundreds of millions of children and youth across the world, we need to pay more attention to how this drug industry is impacting educational access, retention, and even the curriculum, as we saw in the case of Tambores. So I'm gonna stop here, and I very much look forward to comments and questions. Thank you very much. I'm gonna stop sharing.
Amazing. Thank you, Deanna. Yeah, and a Zoom applause all around. I think, unfortunately, our guests are muted, so we can't hear it, but we can feel the energy. So thanks again to all of you for being with us today, and of course to Deanna for that talk. There was so much packed in there, and now we need to turn very shortly to our audience. I see some questions coming in on the Q&A. So collect your thoughts for a few seconds, and please post your questions so we can open up the conversation with Deanna. And I just, yeah, on my side, really, really fascinating, Deanna. I kept thinking of how easy it is for us sometimes in research to try to kind of look at the education sector or system or these practices, in isolation. And you really pointed around the intersectoral kind of critical need to look at that, right? What are these other influences? And we always talk about context matters, and we very richly describe context, but you have really forefronted the context and what is happening in the coca market and with these influences on the educational system. And I think that's a really important reminder for all of us to think about different ways to kind of elevate what is happening in these settings and these surroundings, whether it's around, the influence of drugs or the drug market, or other influences that might be affecting, different research sites that we're working in. So that really, I don't know, captured my attention. And I definitely, and if nobody else asks, I'll come back in a few moments and ask about the local collaboration with the graduates from the schools. I think there's probably a lot to share there about how you initiated that collaboration, what you learned about your own research practice through collaborating with those young people from that particular setting. So I'm going to hold my questions because I see even more coming in the Q&A, which is great. So let's kick things off. And I know some of you, so I can we can mention affiliations, but maybe as you're posting your questions, I invite you to tell us where you are in the world and where you're kind of connecting with us from, just so we get a sense of our reach and our spread. Okay, so first question, Deanna, you can hopefully see these on your side as well, but let's go with Christine's. Okay, so I'll ask you. So, and I can also post it for you if it's helpful. But Christine asks, does your research separate licit coca cultivation, cultivation, I just made up a word, licit coca cultivation from illicit coca cultivation? I think you started to allude to it a little bit in one of those final slides. But if students are being pulled to work in legal fields, what incentives does the state have in place to keep kids in school? Thank you, Christine, for your question. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that question. And that's something that I learned while we were collecting data. When I wrote this proposal, somehow I thought that I would find like licit cultivation versus illicit cultivation. And what I learned is that in one field, coca will be fitting both markets at the same time. So that's something that we need to keep in mind. The same seller is fitting both markets in Limas. In Tambores, that's not happening. All coca is just fitting into drug trafficking. So that's something that we need to keep in mind if we want to challenge a little bit this notion of who is a military target and who's not. And also, it'll help us explain why legal coca economy is possible. And it is not threatening narco trafficking. I mean, coca is there's still enough coca to feed the cocaine market. What's going into the legal market is so small that it doesn't affect the cocaine production. And surprisingly, the school in Limas didn't include much conversation about the illicit coca market. They saw it as an initiative of a small group of people. And in the interviews, they were saying like, oh yeah, we should talk about that. Oh, maybe I should mention it in class. But they haven't bring the coca economy into the classroom in the same way as they did it in Tambores. Maybe because it is too close to the school and they don't feel comfortable. Making that link more explicit. Also, we need to remember that these two contexts are embedded in armed conflict dynamics. So I didn't mention here, but right now in Limas, we have two left-wing guerrilla groups who are struggling for power. In the case of Tambores, is right now the Control One left-wing guerrilla. So it isn't easy to talk about these topics in this context. Christine, did I answer your question?
Yeah, sorry, Christine. I think
I see your face. That's good.
Don't have control over our mute buttons necessarily, but we're getting the nonverbal feedback. And maybe just to extend that a little bit, Deanne, maybe I can combine and build on what Christine was asking, but Idalia is asking for a little more clarification as well about kind of the link between the findings and implication number 2. How would the legal coca market, oh, sorry, Michael, I think you took my question. Hold on. Yeah. How would the legal coca market impact education in terms of like reducing dropout, right? So like how would that come about? How do you see that? If you could elaborate.
So, I mean, first of all, the drug policy reform movement has lots of different branches, and there's no one big solution for drug supply across the world. And if you go to different countries and even within the country, you're going to see different solutions. Right now, the conversation in Colombia is around, okay, from the Colombian government is about don't stop targeting farmers, just allow them to coca crop and focus on those who are turning coca into coca paste and cocaine. But then from civil society actors, you see a big push for regulating coca. And the dream is to guarantee that if coca is regulated and cocaine is regulated too, then there will be a constant flux of money into these communities. The challenge for the state will be to guarantee that the price of coca, of illegal coca, will be as competitive as the price for illegal coca. And that's very difficult to guarantee, particularly when you're thinking about countries that don't have a surplus of resources to pay for that. And as I mentioned before, there's a huge difference in the not only the number of times that you can crop coca during the year, but the amount of money that you will get. Right now, there's a decline in the coca economy, and farmers are making around $17 per arroba. Arroba is a colonial measure. I don't know how to translate it, but that's a measurement. And if you compare that to oranges, it can be $2. So how are they going to guarantee that the price is going to be guaranteed? If they don't do that, what we're going to see is a lot of students just leaving a school because families won't have enough resources to stay in coca plantations. So my main fear is that we cannot say just regulate without thinking, how do we protect the current price? Once the price drops, my fear is that students will leave a school and become just mobile population. Did I answer that question?
Yes, you did, and I can't speak for the person who asked it, but yes.
I can't see faces, so it's hard for me to.
Yeah, no, you're doing great. It's so fascinating. I think it's just a lot to, try to connect the different influences of the market and what the implications are for these young people, and I think you portrayed that really well in that response. Professor Mark Ginsburg has a question for you, and again, you started to touch on this a little bit. But as you talked about the two different schools, could you actually say a little bit more about those? Mark was saying you didn't differentiate too much, obviously, in the quick presentation, but maybe now in the discussion, as you talked about the harvest and the eradication and the bonanza, were there differences across those schools and those communities in the different phases of the work that you were doing that you'd like to elaborate on here?
So I think, thank you for the question. And the big difference is that the coca isn't sustaining a school in Tambores in the same way as it is sustaining it in Limas. In Limas, teachers could see just the money influx coming into school communities. And as I mentioned before, it's not only money that comes, but also time to collaborate and participate in a school endeavors. In Tambores, because Tambores was far away from coca plantations, they just saw the negative side of coca plantations, just students leaving the school. So that will be one of the, that for me is the big difference between these two schools. And again, the fact that in Tambores, they were talking about coca very explicitly in the curriculum, and in Limas, it wasn't. Students will address it in the classroom. We have data from field notes where they mention coca, but they don't have a project around coca, which was paradoxical given that they have a strong project linked to the legal economy there. Mm-hmm. Did I answer my question, Ma?
You got a thumbs up from Mark. Great. And that's really interesting too, right? In terms of how this was coming up in the curriculum, in the content of what was being taught, and you know what the implications of that are as we reflect on it in the here and now, and then down the road, kind of looking back and having students and the teachers and the community kind of, I think, debate the tensions that come with that, right? Yeah. We have lots more questions coming in, Deanna, so let's keep going. Professor Monisha Bajaj, to some extent expectedly, would like to hear about the ways in which the peace process in Colombia is intersecting with the coca education nexus, if at all. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, the peace process is the 13th peace process that Colombia goes through. That's something that I think that we need to clarify. We got very excited with the 2016, but Colombia has gone through peace processes several times. When you read the final accords, you find that the goal is to eradicate coca. So with a lot of participation from coca farmers and with enough support from the state, but the ultimate goal is to guarantee that Colombia won't be a coca producing country. So there was a lot of enthusiasm, and then with Ivan Duque, a president from the right wing, those efforts stopped. The plans that were being implemented in Colombia to guarantee that transition from coca to other crops were basically stopped. So for example, in the region, in northern region of Colombia, only 3% of all the families that could have received from the state receive it. So only 3% for all those years. Right now, Colombia last year elected its first left-wing government, Gustavo Petro, and he has promised not to push for coca eradication, but to focus on the kitchens and the labs where cocaine is being produced. This week, there have been conversations with Mexican president and to start a partnership to transform drug policy reform. That's like big picture. But then if you ask me about local communities, I will say that the first benefit has been not having to negotiate with the military when it comes to coca eradication, because that's also something that was very interesting to me, to see how communities were just negotiating with the military how much coca the military needed to eradicate and how much coca farmers needed to keep to guarantee their livelihoods. So right now, there's no need to do that. And there's a huge decline in the coca market right now. Communities are struggling because Colombia is not the only country producing coca right now. Ecuador, Bolivia, Peru, even Brazil, and coca, Honduras and Mexico are also producing coca. So the prices dropped and families are struggling a lot. Professor Bajaj, did I answer your question? That was like big picture. I hope I did.
Yeah. Monisha, you can give her a thumbs up or you can post a comment in the chat box. No, that was really helpful. I think we've got a few more questions here. I don't know, these two kind of fit together, but they're also distinct, but let me kind of put both of them out there. And I'll combine them and put them in the chat box just so you can see them since they're kind of two pieces. But we have Cameron who's asking, do you find that involvement in the coca trade or coca market provides protection or resilience to recruitment in guerrilla groups for those students, youth, and families? So on that, so thinking about that protection and resilience for those who are involved in this. And then we have another question, somewhat connected, but from a different angle. Johanny is asking, and then so how can policymakers and educators use the insights from this study to address the challenges posed by the interconnection of the war on drugs and educational access and retention? And I'm posting those double questions in the chat box, Deanna, if it's helpful to lay your eyes on them. So the protection resilience piece, it's interesting to think about that, right? Is being involved in this actually adding a protective layer in terms of the guerrilla connection? Go with that first, and then I can add in for you.
I mean, what we have learned through this research is that there's no one drug supply chain. In Colombia, we're not currently facing one armed conflict. We talk about 30 different armed conflicts because of all the many armed actors, and armed actors are working within the drug supply chain in very different ways. So in Northern Colombia, you're going to find that they're building corporations where they control the whole drug supply chain. They're buying land, coca cropping, transforming it, and then selling it. But then in Southern Colombia, you're going to find farmers who are selling the leaves to a buyer, and then that buyer sells them to go to the labs, and from the labs somebody buys it and sells it to send it to the kitchen. So I'm just emphasizing here that there is a very intricate and network of actors, and at some points of those drug supply chains, you're gonna find not only left-wing guerrillas but also right-wing paramilitary groups. And unfortunately, in Colombia, even though we talk about the dissidents or the ELN, these don't necessarily operate as a unit. The ELN right now in Northern Colombia promised to stop dealing with coca and is pushing farmers to eradicate coca and substitute. So I don't have a simple answer to your question. What I can definitely tell you is that when students are coca cropping with their families, they are protected, they're fine. I mean, every Saturday and Sunday, they will go and learn how to take care of the plants. As you saw in the data, they also have their own pieces of land. But as the plant travels to become cocaine, the level of violence increases. So I don't think that we want children to participate in the drug supply chain. I think that we need to recognize the role that they're playing, but I wouldn't say that it will guarantee any protection. Also, I know that the bylaws by the ELN completely forbid the use of any substance, of any psychoactive substance and alcohol. So if they see students who are taking drugs, they will be punished by their disciplinary procedures. So not an easy answer. My intuition at this point will be no. Also because the students start learning the deal, and sometimes they move from plantation to the lab and then to the kitchen. And
wait, Deanna, hold that thought. I'm going to interject a question to build on to that and then come back to that other one I asked you, just because another Deanna who's with us was curious about the forced recruitment of children in these locations. And so we were talking about the protection, either potential extensions of protection or the protection violations that are happening amongst the children and youth. So our Deanna Zerda would like to know a little bit more about that. What's happening with forced recruitment, and how is it related to the fact that coca is being cultivated and children are considered, laborers in this process?
So we don't have data on recruitment, particularly for tambores. What we have data on is on how kids are combining coca cropping with coal and gold mining in the region. So that's the other risk that we find. And in Limas, there was no recruitment by armed actors at that point. It seems from the data that we have that recruitment will happen later in the supply chain. But due to ethical concerns in our research, we only stick to the first phase of the supply chain, which is coca cultivation. We didn't ask any questions about what happens in the labs and the kitchens. So I just want to clarify that we don't have data on what happens there.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Sienna. So now I'm going to go back to that last part of that question and actually add in another one that I think are nicely connected. So just again, Johanni had asked previously, how can policymakers and educators use the insights from the study to address the challenges posed by the interconnection of the war on drugs and educational access and retention? And Walter is also kind of coming along those lines as well, saying you talked about drug reforms and how they should be established, but what about educational ones? How do you think and connect and see educational reforms on this matter? So let's see if we can combine Walter and Johanni's questions a little bit.
So thank you very much for those two questions, because those are the ones that take us to dream about where do we want to see this knowledge going and doing. So the first thing that I would love is for policymakers within the educational sector recognize that the war on drugs has impacted and is impacting children and youth across the supply chain. Within the Ministry of Education in Colombia, you're going to find one public official who's responsible for drug education. And drug education normally means prohibitionist education. In the US, you had just say no, and that program there traveled to 54 countries, one of them Colombia. So there's no acknowledgement of how the coca economies are impacting children. So that's the first thing that I would like to see. And then I also think that this research has important implications for how we think about educational access and retention and curriculum. It is very sad to me, and this is a personal opinion, to see that in a context where there are important efforts to produce or to turn coca into a legal commodity, there's no space within the curriculum to talk about it. I mean, the school should be the place where kids learn about it, learn about the possibilities and experiment. And coca could be such a productive space for an interdisciplinary project that could connect not only different grades and subjects, but also parents, children, and teachers. So it will have implications for those working on educational access, but also working on curriculum, and on how we think about who's a coca farmer. Unfortunately, in Colombia, coca farmers have been portrayed as menaces to the social order. And what we see here is that they're teachers, they're students. And again, this point of them becoming rich by coca cropping, it's a myth. It's just they're just earning enough to survive, to have a decent life. So I think that it also helps us make a point about the need to pay attention to rural education in a country that used to be rural for at least maybe the last 180 years. So I will highlight those 3 points, but I'm sure that we can come up with more opportunities. Thank you.
Thanks, Deanna. We're closing in. We got about 5 minutes left. I'm going to sneak in one more question. And you just started to touch on it a little bit there about the attention that's needed, in these particular areas. And so we have a question from Nicolas, who says, just curious about the opinions or the positions of education, kind of public officials about the schools and the teachers who are working in these contexts, or are they kind of ignored or neglected because of where they're located or because of the work that they're engaged in? Just, have you had a sense, or was that part of your research, your analysis? What were kind of public officials' opinions, comments, advocacy in this area? Yeah.
So I had never heard public officials recognize that teachers are also coca farmers. I'm excited about sharing these findings with them. We want to make sure that we are done with data analysis to share a policy brief with them. But something that we need to remember is that in the history of the armed conflict in Colombia, areas where coca grows have been completely neglected by the state and also labeled as red zones, zonas rojas. So social investment, the state gets there. If we are talking about the military, they are there. They really know the land. The question is when it comes to social investment. So all this to say that no, I haven't heard any educational policymaker talking about teachers playing all these multiple roles in their communities. But I will hope that will challenge how they see who's a victim and a victimizer within the context of the armed conflict in Colombia.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Deanna. And I think we're probably out of time. I'm just going to share quickly the last 2 questions that were posed so you can continue to think about it for your work. So Adalia was asking about the links with dropout. So when we, typically see downturns in the economic situation, there's usually maybe a spike in dropout because people are, moving on to find other solutions to help feed their families and cover basic necessities. Or, at what times we'll see the inverse of that. So there was just some curiosity about, did you look at dropout rates among the kids and over different periods of time and what might explain that one way or the other? And then Mark Ginsburg also wanted to ask a little bit more. And I think there's a lot for you to write on about just the methodology that you did and the local collaboration. But he was asking about the challenges that your field researchers may or may not have faced in terms of violence from the military, left-wing or right-wing groups, and how to avoid or kind of deal with those, right? So the ethics and the protection issues that come up for the research team when they're engaging in these environments. I think it'd be really helpful to hear more about that. Sadly, we're out of time to dive into that, but I see future publications for you, Deanna, about those issues. So I think just in closing, thanks to everyone for joining us for the inaugural NICE webinar. We're hoping to squeeze these into your really busy days and lots of interesting events that are happening. But Deanna, what a pleasure to have you kick things off and sharing your fascinating work. I think we learned a lot from you today, and we'll continue to think about the findings and the implications of your study. So thank you, and best wishes with your next endeavor. And then just finally, I want a big shout out to Dr. Leslie Bartlett and her leadership for organizing all of the speakers so far for this semester, and to her colleague, Michael Dixon, for providing the technical support for today's event. So thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you at the next NICE event.